Hello and welcome to the 8th lecture video in the Sheridan College online degree breadth elective course, Introduction to Medieval History. Today, as we move further into the High Middle Ages, we shall see the Christian and Islamic worlds go to war. We'll see how a powerful pope took advantage of a wave of religious fervor sweeping across Europe and united the military feudal class for the first time in history. As enthusiasm for the Crusades spread across European society, we'll see how it also sparked a wave of anti-Semitic violence across the continent, led by a growing army of knights and peasants alike. We'll see the rise of the Crusader States and the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem. We'll see how the same wave of religious enthusiasm that launched the Crusades resulted in an explosion of new Christian orders, including the White Monk Cistercians and the Knights Templar. We'll also see the Islamic world regroup and fight back, pushing the Christians out of the Holy Land under the leadership of the great leader Saladin. All that today on Introduction to Medieval History. The learning outcomes for today's lesson are: Number 1. Describe the historical context and progression of the First Crusade and the Crusader States. Number 2. Understand the wave of religious orders of the 12th century, including the Cistercians and the Knights Templar. And number 3, describe the failure of the Second Crusade and the rise of Saladin. In our last video, we saw how a series of popes epitomized by Gregory VII had embarked on a series of reforms which transformed Western Christianity and positioned the Pope as a powerful leader. However, the rise of the Pope had also seen the further fragmentation of Christian unity. In 1054 CE, the religion officially split into two halves. In the West, it was led by the Pope in Rome, who increasingly challenged the other leaders in Europe, such as German emperors, for dominance and power. However, in the East, in the Byzantine Empire and Kievan Rus, it was the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Byzantine Emperor who held power. However, their days of power were waning. To the east and the south of the Byzantines, the Seljuk Turks increasingly challenged their dominance. The Seljuks had originated in the grasslands of Central Asia, and during the High Middle Ages, they had expanded and conquered much of the Eastern Islamic world. They adopted Islam and became staunch adherents to the Sunni branch of the religion. In 1071, they defeated the forces of the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert, establishing their dominance in Anatolia, the former heartland of the Byzantine Empire. 2 years later, the Seljuks captured Jerusalem from the Fatimids, a rival Islamic power who were followers of the Shia branch of Islam, and cemented their control of Palestine. By the end of the first century of the new millennia, the Seljuk Turks had established themselves as the dominant force in Anatolia and the Middle East. The one thing standing in the way of their expansion further into Europe was the ancient and weak Byzantine Empire. Yet year by year, they pushed the Byzantines further and further north, chipping away at their borders. In March of 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Komnenos sent a desperate plea for help to the Western kingdoms. The Seljuks had advanced as far as the ancient city of Nicaea. The emperor believed that without Western support, the empire's days would be numbered. At the Council of Piacenza, his ambassadors pled their case before Pope Urban II. This was the opportunity Urban had been waiting for. For half a century, the two sides of the Christian church had been separate. Now, here with a weakened Byzantine Empire and a desperate emperor, was an opportunity to bring them together once again. And more importantly, for the Pope to assume the mantle of leadership for all Christians. A few months later, Urban II gave a speech outside the town of Clermont in central France. A large crowd of French nobles and clergy had gathered to hear what he had to say. This speech would change the course of history. Several versions of the speech survive, but differ on many points. The one common theme was that Christians everywhere must answer the Byzantine call for help. He called upon Christians to take up a new type of war. A holy war. A war in which, if you fought, your sins would be forgiven. The rally cry which was taken up was Deus levot, God wills it. The call was for a holy crusade, and it spread like wildfire across Europe. In all, nearly 100,000 people would sign up into the various armed militias, including 60,000 soldiers, but also old men, youth, women, children, and peasants, all sorts of people. The appeal of the crusade attracted many different types. Some were inspired with religious fervor, others jumped at the chance of redemption to have their sins wiped away. Others saw the opportunity for profit, the chance to gain new lands, wealth, and fame. For others, it was simply a way to earn enough money to survive. The new wealthy class of merchants saw opportunity too, with backing it in an effort to gain access to wealthy trade routes. For the Byzantine Emperor, the crusade meant the opportunity to regain territory lost to the Seljuks. The first waves set off in the summer of 1096 towards Jerusalem. They were ill-disciplined and without clear leadership. In Eastern Europe, in the Germanic-speaking lands, a motley group of crusaders formed. Inspired by a preacher named Peter the Hermit, who was described by contemporaries as barefoot and small, along with a landless knight known as Walter the Penniless. Together, they managed to attract a following of peasants, poor knights, and mercenaries. This so-called People's Crusade also made its way towards the Holy Land. However, they took a more circuitous route, weaving through several German cities, looking for enemies closer to home. They turned their wrath and hate toward the small Jewish communities along the way. Anti-Semitism had always been present in Europe, but in the religious fervor of the Crusades, it took on new proportions. Existing in small, insular communities, often in urban areas, the Jews of medieval Europe were an easy target. For some of the Crusaders, their quest was not just to expel Muslims from what they considered Christian lands, but all non-Christians. The so-called People's Crusade, on their rampage southward, would be brutal. Some Jews were forced at sword point to convert to Christianity, others robbed or beaten, many others killed. Whole communities of Jewish people at Metz, Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne were massacred, the first victims of the Crusade. When the People's Crusade finally arrived in Constantinople, they were planning on stopping only temporarily on their way to the Holy Land. However, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios had other plans. From his point of view, all crusaders were his armies to command. Moreover, his goal was not necessarily the Holy Land, but to push the Seljuk Turks out of Anatolia. He sent the ragtag mob of untrained peasants and poor knights to Asia Minor to confront a well-trained Seljuk army, where they were ambushed and wiped out. Another wave of crusaders would fare better. Composed of established knights and professional soldiers, including Normans, French, and others, they arrived at Constantinople in early 1096 and began to organize. Over the next year, they reconquered the city of Nicaea after besieging it with catapults. In the initial stages of the crusade, the Byzantine emperor had tried to maintain control over the armies. He had the various leaders of the crusaders swear allegiance to him. When the city of Nicaea surrendered, it did so formally to the Byzantine emperor. However, amongst the crusaders were also some who at one point had been enemies of Alexios. In fact, the Norman warrior leader Bohemond had only a few years earlier been at war with the Byzantines. Now, they were uneasy and unlikely allies. After the success of Nicaea, the armies of the Crusaders increasingly ignored the leadership of Alexios and became independent armies. One Crusader army under the leadership of Baldwin of Boulogne split from the rest, moving further east, and conquered the city of Edessa from the Seljuk Turks. Edessa and the surrounding area had once been an important center of the Byzantine Empire until they lost it to the Seljuk Turks. However, rather than return the territory to the Byzantines, Baldwin would found the first of the Crusader States, new Christian realms which would be the fruits of the Crusade. The main Crusader army moved toward the city of Antioch, which they besieged for several months and eventually took. Now the holy city of Jerusalem lay within their grasp. In June of 1099, the crusading force gathered outside the walls of Jerusalem. Out of the vast army which had left Europe 4 years before, approximately 1,300 knights and 12,000 foot soldiers were left. But the force was determined, and within a month, the city would be theirs. On July 15, 1099, after a month-long siege, the Crusaders finally broke through the Muslim defenses and scaled the walls of Jerusalem. Their victory was accompanied by terrible bloodshed. According to most sources, a mass slaughter of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of the city followed. But Jerusalem was now in the hands of the Crusaders. The victory of the First Crusade was nothing short of astounding. It had caught the Islamic world completely off guard, whose leaders had failed to anticipate the Crusaders as a serious threat. They would not make the same mistake again, and the gains of the Christians would prove difficult to hold. In the years that followed, several Christian states were established in the Holy Land and Anatolia: the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and chief among them all, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They were known as the Crusader States, and they would last in one form or another until 1291 CE. Ruled by a military Christian elite, the states were in a near constant tenuous position and frequently short on manpower and supplies. In order to continue to exist, the states required a steady stream of new recruits from Europe. It was in this environment that a new blend of militarism and religion developed in the region. A religious order of knights known as the Knights Templar was founded to help defend the Crusader States. The Knights Templar took vows of poverty and chastity similar to those of monks. The order would eventually grow in size and power and become one of the most visible symbols of the Crusades. However, the Knights Templar were really only part of a larger wave of new religious orders which were transforming the Christian Church in the 11th and 12th centuries. In this mix of new orders, the Templars' novel approach of blending the role of warrior and monk survived and achieved official recognition from the Church in large part due to the support of one powerful patron, the leader of another, relatively new but powerful religious movement in Europe: Bernard of Clairvaux and the Cistercian monks. Many of these new religious movements were reacting against the changes to how monks and nuns lived their lives in the High Middle Ages. By the 11th century, monasteries had become important community hubs and landowners. The network of Cluniac monasteries had become wealthy and worldly. New orders such as the Carthusians, a group of hermits which emerged in the 11th century, rejected what they saw as the corruption and extravagance of the world. They took strict vows of silence and strove to live in desolate locations in isolation from the world. Another new order, the Cistercian monks, which was co-founded by Bernard of Clairvaux, explicitly aspired to a stricter interpretation of the old monastic rule of Saint Benedict, which had formed the basic guidelines for all monasteries since the early Middle Ages. To Bernard and the Cistercians, the older order of monks, such as the Cluniacs, had become too lax, too decadent, and too rich. The Cistercians strove for simplicity. They rejected all forms of decoration, and their monasteries were plain and simple, built with smooth-cut, undecorated stone. Their strive for simplicity was reflected in the robes they wore, which were not dyed black like that of other monks, but instead left in the natural color of the wool itself: white. In time, the white monk Cistercians would become one of the most popular and widespread monastic orders in Europe, with monasteries dotted across the landscape. Ironically, their success would also transform them, attracting more donations and wealth, making them one of the most powerful religious groups in Europe, In time, many future popes would begin their careers as Cistercian monks, a testament to the prestige of the order. Indeed, it would be a former Cistercian monk, Pope Eugenius III, who would decide to call for the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. Eugenius's call for another crusade was prompted by the tide of power turning against the Christian Crusader States. In the wake of the First Crusade, the Seljuk Sultanate lost much of its power. In the decades that followed, new Turkic Muslim groups began to vie for power and eventually to threaten the Christian states. Imad al-Din Zengi, better known as just Zengi, had become the leader of a Western Turkic people called the Oghuz Turks. Under the Seljuks, the Oghuz had been soldiers. Zengi's father had been a Mamluk, a type of military slave commonly used in the armies of the Seljuks. Despite his slave status, Zengi's father had risen through the ranks to achieve a high position, but was ultimately executed by the leader of Damascus for treason. In the power vacuum that followed the First Crusade, Zengi managed to rise to a position of power himself, eventually uniting the cities of Aleppo and Mosul under his personal rule. However, in 1144 CE, Zengi turned his army towards the Christian Crusader States, and in a dramatic turn of events, managed to conquer the county of Edessa. Edessa had been the first Christian Crusader state to have been founded, and it would be the first to fall. Although Zengi himself died shortly afterwards, he had become a hero of the Islamic world, and his lineage would establish a new dynasty in the region, the Zengids. Under the leadership of his son, Nur al-Din, the Oghuz Turks would continue to expand their power. The fall of Edessa, just 4 decades after the success of the First Crusade, was a massive blow to the Christian world. As news of the disaster spread, it sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Almost immediately, there were renewed calls for a new crusade to take the county back. On December 1st, 1145 CE, Pope Eugenius III formally called for the Second Crusade. Like the first one, the Pope promised that Crusaders would have their sins forgiven if they answered the call. He was joined in his recruitment efforts by the co-founder of the Cistercian order, Bernard of Clairvaux. Over 2 years, a massive Crusader army, some 60,000 men, was recruited and left Europe for the Holy Land. This time, they were led by kings. One group by the German king, Conrad III, and another by the French king, Louis VII. In early 1148, they arrived in Jerusalem. However, there a fateful decision was made to first attack the city of Damascus rather than Edessa on the grounds that it held more strategic importance. In the spring of 1148, the siege of Damascus began, but infighting between the Christian forces brought the crusade to a disastrous end. After just 4 days of besieging the city, they gave up and went home. The failure of the Second Crusade ended in humiliation for the Christians. In the Islamic world, the waning power of both the Crusader states and the old Seljuk Sultanate continued to destabilize the region. Zengi's son, Nur al-Din, continued to expand the Zengid dynasty further, expanding his power base as the Islamic world began to war against itself. Just 6 years after the Second Crusade, Nur al-Din seized Damascus for himself and began to consolidate his rule over all of Syria. In 1164, a new opportunity to expand arose when the Zengids were called upon to help resolve a dynastic dispute in the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. The Fatimid dynasty had ruled Egypt and much of North Africa since the early 10th century as one of the only power bases for the Shia branch of Islam. However, by the High Middle Ages, the dynasty was in decline. Administrative leaders known as viziers increasingly held more and more power, and the Fatimid Caliph largely became a figurehead. And they had many enemies. On one side, they were threatened by the Sunni Islamic powers such as the Abbasids, Almoravids, and Seljuks, and on the other, by the rise of the Christian Crusader states. In 1162, crusading armies had attempted to invade Egypt, and the Fatimids had been forced to pay tribute in a humiliating show of weakness. Sensing their disarray, Nur al-Din sent representatives to the Fatimid court in Egypt, ostensibly to help resolve a dispute between rival claimants for the position of vizier. The man he sent to Egypt was named Shirkuh, from a Kurdish family of warriors known as the Ayyubids. He was accompanied on his expedition to Egypt by his nephew Yusuf. In 1169 CE, while keeping the Fatimid Caliph in his role as a figurehead, Shirkuh took over the position of vizier of Egypt, effectively bringing Egypt under his control and thus under the control of Nur al-Din. When Shirkuh died shortly afterwards, he was succeeded in the role of vizier by his nephew Yusuf, who is better known by his honorific name, Salah al-Din, meaning righteousness of the faith, or, as it's usually rendered in English, Saladin. Saladin would ultimately become one of the most successful leaders of the Islamic world and build an empire which would threaten the very existence of the Crusader States. When Nur al-Din died in 1174, Saladin, already an effective leader of Egypt, marched his army into Syria. Using a mixture of diplomacy and military might, he would eventually bring much of the Middle East under his control. Saladin's remarkable leadership and effectiveness as a military leader had already made him a powerful rival to the Christian kingdoms. But what made Saladin unique was his ability to rally the Islamic world under his cause. Just like the Crusaders had used religion as a potent rallying call for their forces, Saladin called upon all Muslims to rally in a holy war of their own. He made it his mission to reverse the gains of the Crusaders and to push the Christians out of the Holy Land altogether. On July 4th, 1187, Saladin's armies met with those of the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin, in what is now present-day Israel. The Crusader army was led by the King of Jerusalem, a force of perhaps 20,000 men. On the opposing side, Saladin commanded an army twice as large of 40,000. For the Christians, the battle was a disaster. With their ability to wage war largely destroyed at Hattin, they were in no position to resist Saladin's further advance. 2 months later, Saladin captured the city of Jerusalem itself. The Christian Crusader States were reduced to just a few small ports, and the success of the First Crusade had almost been entirely reversed. Over the next century, the Christians and Muslim worlds would continue to war in the Holy Land many times. While the Christians would regain some of their lost territory during the Third Crusade, never again would they reach the same heights in the Holy Land. While Saladin's empire would break apart after his death, he had provided a model of holy war for the Islamic world that would counter the Christian Crusade. Just over 100 years after Saladin's victory at Hattin, the Christians would face their final defeat with the fall of the city of Acre in 1291 CE, marking the end of the Crusader States forever and the end of the Crusades in the Middle East. Despite centuries of warfare between the Christian and Islamic worlds, the legacy of the Crusades is complex. For Western Europe, the Crusades brought contact with a much wider world that included trade routes and cultural links stretching to India and China. Arabic advances in algebra, optics, and engineering all found their way into European intellectual discourse. The Crusades also introduced into Europe many goods considered exotic and expensive by Europeans, such as oranges, lemons, and even early forms of gunpowder. For the Islamic world, the memory of the Crusades did fade. However, the figure of Saladin would become a model of a powerful leader, and his exploits were celebrated for generations. In our next lecture video, we will finish our exploration of the High Middle Ages as we move into the 13th century. We'll see how the increasing power of European kings leads to a growing complexity of governments and bureaucracies. We'll see how, as kings become more powerful, they face pushback from noble lords, and the first example of a check on royal power, the Magna Carta. We'll also examine the art and culture of the High Middle Ages, including changes to medieval marriage, the introduction of universities, the explosion of literature written in French and English, the rise of Gothic architecture, and the spread of medieval heretical movements. All that next time on Introduction to Medieval History.